Good afternoon, and welcome back to USTA Florida's Here to Serve podcast. My name is Laura Bowen, and I'm the Executive Director here at USTA Florida. In today's episode, we are going to tackle one of my favorite topics, women in tennis. And the timing couldn't be better as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of equal pay at the US Open. If you've been following USTA Florida for the last couple of years, you know that advancing women in tennis is a big initiative for us. We've hosted a number of all-girls tennis camps, and we're also delivering all-women coaches trainings and, for the first time ever, a women's speakers training. The question is, are we solving the problems that we set out to solve? And how do we know if we're making progress? Well, my guests today are helping us answer those questions. Aasha Joshi and Candace are experts at research, analysis, and evaluation. They are dedicated to helping organizations like ours identify and meet our goals. They are the principals of Clarity Writing and Research, and they've been working with us for months now to dig into the work that we've already done, the landscape we're operating in, and will help us identify ways that we can continue to advance women in tennis. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I can't wait to share with you the findings of our research later this fall. Well, welcome Candace and Aasha to the Here to Serve podcast. I'm so glad that you're with me today. Can you give us a little bit of your background and how you came to create this thing called Clarity Writing and Research?
We definitely can. Hello, and thank you so much for having us. This is where Aasha gets to say hello if she wants to.
This is Aasha. Yes, and we absolutely can share our story. It started over 20 years ago at this point.
Wow.
When Candace and I first met near a bunch of dumpsters. We had we had dorm rooms next to each other, and we both happened to be taking out our garbage at the same time. And we're trapped near the dumpsters by some aggressive raccoons. And instead of,
because it turns out they're all monsters.
Yeah. And instead of fighting the raccoons, which, we don't have the skills for that, but we decided to just let them pass and be. And in the meantime, while we're holding our garbage, looking at these raccoons and then looking at each other, one of us, and I can't remember who, said, "Wait, aren't you in my phenomenology class?"
Yeah. What's a phenomenology class? Please explain this.
It is a
class. We were in a philosophy class with actually, I think, a fairly famous philosopher, right? Alan Wood. I think people who maybe majored in philosophy will be like, oh, I maybe know that name. And I didn't even remember that it was phenomenology, so Aasha might have to tell you what it was actually about. I just remember philosophy, Alan Wood, and Alan Wood sent maybe my favorite email that I have ever seen from a professor. So yeah, I don't even remember what the class was about. I know we had to read Kant again, and
we did. Phenomenology is the study of phenomenon, and part of in that class and in that sort of subfield of philosophy really jump-started my interest in research, because part of what is introduced in phenomenology is something called the hermeneutic method. But essentially it's like, hey, read this thing, go think about it, read it again, think about it again. It's far more complex, but in its most basic form, that's what it is when a reader is constantly returning to the original text to interpret it appropriately.
You just described my entire English literature degree program there in like 2 sentences. It's like, go read it, think about it, come back, read it again, think about it some more, write about it, go read it.
And then sometimes talk about it in class.
And sometimes once a week talk about it.
Yeah.
And
But there's
there's
a reason that describes your English career, right? Because the type of literary analysis that is, I think, still probably the most common in university settings is a hermeneutic approach to the analysis of literature, right?
This explains a lot. I will say that I've forgotten all of those things that I analyzed and critically thought about. So,
but you
and
remember
now I'm
the
much more
approach.
fascinated in this, like in this.
You
research
remember
that
the
we're doing.
approach, which is actually the most important part.
And that
Which is what-
actually, go ahead.
I was going to say this is actually where clarity comes from, right? The approach, which is any good college professor will, if pressed, acknowledge that the specific content of their course is probably actually not the most important reason you're there. The reason you're there is to learn ways of thinking, right? And so that type of hermeneutic, Aasha was saying that it kind of awakened her interest in research. And for me, it reinforced something that I had been doing as an undergraduate in interpreting texts, which was read it, think about it, ask a lot of questions, question the assumptions you have made, talk about it, probably, write about it, definitely, and probably think about it some more before you turn that paper in, right? So this sort of circle, but not a vicious circle. There is actually the term virtuous circle. It just doesn't get used as much. So
I love that we're talking about this because I think that one of the things that we struggle with, at least in business and in my industry, in my business, is that we're always looking for the quick, easy answer. Let's do a survey and whatever that says is what we do, right? And, part of what we've been struggling with for a really long time was like, why can't we find this easy answer, right? We do this, it works. Yay, do more of this. And we decided very intentionally to do this, which was let's read some stuff, look at some stuff, think about it, go back, think about it. And I think at first, it was super uncomfortable. But once we got into it, there was sort of all of these moments of clarity, unintended, that came behind that. And
I like where your head's at.
it was really wonderful. And so I'm glad that even though I asked you the question how you met and I didn't know how you were going to answer it, it actually is such a great window into why, we're doing this work and what we're about to talk about today, minus the raccoons, which is also a phenomenal part of that story. So they were critically thinking how they could get the trash out of your hands that day.
I mean, honestly, research backs you up on that. Raccoons are way smarter than people should be comfortable with them being, honestly, because...
Well, I learned they're mini bears, by the way. So that's what I call them now. They're more closely related to bears than anything. So I feel like raccoon has such a bad connotation to it that I just want to call them mini bears. So I'm like, oh, I have a mini bear. And bears also like trash. So it kind of correlates. Like bears like trash, but they're large and frightening. And you got this mini bear that's going to dive in your dumpster and also eat your trash.
Here's what's great about that. People routinely call raccoons trash pandas. I grew up hearing pandas as panda bears. Pandas are not bears, even though we called them panda bears. So there's like a whole circle there, Laura, between bears and panda bears and trash pandas and raccoons. I love it.
Gotten into this podcast, and I already feel it will be the most popular pod we've ever done.
No pressure.
Either that or this will be my last episode of the Here to Serve podcast, and we will end at 101.
They'll reassign it.
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to get it reassigned, so this might be the one that's just so they already had. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about research. That's our topic today. So when a lot of people hear that term, at least the people I'm in circles with, they automatically think of surveys. In fact, that's what we thought of. It's like, oh, we'd send out a survey. That's called research. So maybe can you all share what research is and maybe some of the things that research is not?
This is actually one of my favorite topics, says the occasional university professor. So first of all, I said this to Aasha when we talked about this. It is always interesting to me that someone would say, oh, the first thing I think of when I think of research is surveys, because I am from the humanities. I almost never think of surveys. I think about research a lot, and I almost never think of surveys. When I think research, I think books, which sometimes have the results of surveys in them. But what I really think is deep dive into someone's talking about something and what I can learn from what these other people have thought, right? And that's not unrelated to what research is. I thought about this and I realized that the first definition of research that I came up with was very, very specific. It was the definition of research someone would give you if they were trained in the humanities and had done a certain type of research for longer than I'm going to count on my fingers right now, right? And then I tried to step back and say, okay, and it's in its most basic form, and this is the thing that research can help you learn to do, right? In its most basic form, what is research? I am going to say, as a general bare bones working definition, that research, and there are more and less formal ways of defining it and of doing it, right? But I'm going to say that research is a careful process of learning about something by collecting information carefully. The word carefully comes up a lot in there, right? You're learning, you're collecting information, you're doing these things carefully. Because it involves learning, I'm going to say that involves asking questions as opposed to thinking you already know the answer. Because if you think you already know the answer and you're not willing to have anything perhaps shake your certainty about that answer, it's not really research. I'm going to take a hard hand
Such
there.
a good point. Such a good point. As I think sometimes people go into these exercising things thinking, I'm going to do a survey and it's going to tell me all the things. It's going to back up my theory of what I already know, right? You almost approach it as like proving a theory versus, like you said, like investigation and talking to people and, hey, like, what do you, and going in there sort of with that blank slate.
We're big on asking questions, and that'll come up. What I'm actually gonna say, Aasha, right? So I gave what I feel like is kind of a bare bones, general definition of research that I think will probably sound familiar to people, whether they are professional researchers or not, right? Anyone who sits down and is like, I'm gonna do some research on X can probably relate to, I have some questions, I'm gonna collect some information, I'm going to see what I can learn from the information I collect. So I'm, though, going to punt to Aasha for a slightly more formal definition of research.
Thank you, Candace. So when I hear the word, what is research, Candace is right. I think a little bit more formally because of my training in the social sciences. I love surveys. I'm trained to design them and create them and test them.
It's actually
That is my area of expertise.
Strongest areas of expertise. Yeah.
Yeah. It's what I did my PhD in. I love a survey. I'm also hopefully going to be one of the people that says, let's not start there necessarily. Because when I think of research, I'm thinking it often from a social sciences perspective. Social sciences is, the study of people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It spans a whole variety of different things. And social science research, for me, starts with asking good questions. So we do not decide on how we're going to answer those questions. First, we have to start with, hey, what is the question we are trying to answer? Rather than, a survey will tell us what we need to know. It's the other way around. What do we need to know? And asking those good questions starts with thinking about, okay, is my topic focused enough? Can it actually be answered? And can it be answered through the collection and analysis of primary and secondary data? And when I'm saying data, I don't mean cherry-picked evidence. I mean a thorough collection of data. And when I say primary data, I mean data that we have collected ourselves versus secondary data, which is data or research that has been collected by others, all of which is still can be incredibly trustworthy, presuming it's collected in a careful way and in an appropriate way and is not cherry-picked. So that is a very bare bones version of what I think research is. But it does not start with, how are we going to answer this question? It starts with, well, what is our question?
Which is a great segue, because we went through this exercise with you both. And I have to say, how this even started was actually, I was sharing with Candace that we're really bad at doing surveys. In fact, we had dinner last year, almost a year ago now. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, we're so bad at doing surveys. Like, and I remember Candace saying, everyone is. Like, you're not alone. All organizations are bad. That's why we're employed. And I was like, oh, thanks for
Surveys are
feel
much
better.
harder than people think. Yeah.
So
Well, because good questions are harder than people think, right?
yes, yes. So that was kind of where everything started. And then we've been working with both of you on researching one of our really big topics, which is the state of women in the tennis industry. And, you actually made us answer some really important questions. Like you said, what is the question we're trying to answer here? Like, not just, hey, here's the topic. Where do we, like, let's get a bunch of stuff about it. So could you share maybe with our audience a little bit about your approach to this topic we kind of threw at you, and then maybe why it resonates with you both as women and leaders in your own business?
Sure. Candace, do you want to go first, or would you like me to?
Well, I'm good either way. I will jump in and say that, as Laura knows, we talked about this first very, very informally, right? We were just having dinner, and I said, well, Aasha's real good at surveys. But you'll remember, I also said, but let's have a conversation first and see if a survey is what you need.
Yes.
And part of the reason I had that thought was state of women in tennis is really broad, right? It is a topic, but it is a very broad topic. And there are so many ways to come at it. There are so many things that you could know about it. There are so many ways that you could try to learn something about that, right? So my thinking was, let's actually have a talk first, see if we can narrow down focus, or at least split focus into some categories to give us a sense of how we should approach it, right? So that actually should give people a little hint into the process, right? We don't start with how are we going to answer this question. We also don't start with how are we going to approach this whole topic, right? We start with how can we narrow down, put some more shape on, make something more specific to give us some guidance for which way to go. And when we talked, what we sort of figured out from listening to you guys, it's an important part.
Yeah, you did listen a lot.
Actually listening. And I know that complicates we'd love, can we just get the easy answer, right? I don't mean from you guys in particular, for everybody, right? Let's just go ask the experts and they'll tell us. And half of the time, what actually needs to happen is we have to make you talk to help us figure out how to help you, right? But what we kind of came to was that there were 3 areas within that broader topic of women in tennis that you guys were really both thinking about and trying to figure out how to take action in: playing, coaching, and leadership. So our conversations from the very first one, the notes that we were taking were, scribbling, what are they talking about? What questions are they asking? What kinds of things are they saying they want to learn? And kind of the themes that came out, sometimes explicitly and sometimes not explicitly, were playing, right? Get more girls and women playing, coaching, get more women coaching, but also thinking about what the experience of coaching is like for women, right? And then women, not just in the industry, but in leadership positions. I think the phrase you guys used that came up a few times was decision makers.
Yes.
Right. So not just seeing women's faces in the room, but how to have women more frequently making decisions, and also what that experience is like when they are doing it. So that's kind of how we decided to approach it. We sort of split it into 3.
So we went from one question, what is the state of women in tennis, to 3 questions, what is the state of women in these 3 categories? So the question became both narrow, but that helped us sort of focus our inquiry into these different areas. So we now have sort of the beginnings of thinking about an approach of like, okay, so these are the 3 questions we're trying to answer. How should we go about doing that? And I'd also add that one of the things we also did to focus our inquiry was it's not just what is the state of women in tennis, but it was the state of women in tennis in these 3 areas in Florida. So again, even narrowing our focus so we get to an answerable question, because otherwise it's too big and it can't be approached.
And that was really important to us. I'm glad that you touched on that, was that, the scope of our work is Florida. And I think so much of the information that we get, and I use that very broadly, it could be a survey, it could be research, is so nationally driven. But as we all know, Florida is its own sort of thing a lot of times. And we were super curious to really maybe narrow it in that bucket as well, to say how specific can we get to what's happening here in Florida, which is kind of a little bit of a good lead into my next question. So of course, here I am not knowing anything about how this process works, which is why we hired you. And I'm like, great. So we're just going to get a report, answer these questions for Florida. And you all did something magical, because you're smart, you know how to do this, is you sort of looked at the landscape overall. Like, that was sort of the very first thing that I think you shared with us. And so that's kind of what I want to dig into now. As you researched the overall state of women, and not just in tennis, but in sports and all the other things, what did you find in that process? And was there anything that surprised you, Candace, when you started digging into that stuff?
So I'll back up for a second and say, I'm glad that you kind of phrased the beginning of that the way that you did. You, at one point you said, how specific can we get in thinking about women in tennis and Florida? And there's not a single answer to that, because sometimes you can get really specific on something, right? Sometimes you can't. That relies on a few different things. Maybe the research isn't out there, right? Maybe no one else has been asking the question yet. Maybe there's research, but it doesn't actually give you the categories of answers that you want, right? You mentioned a lot of things are nationally driven, but then that also means if they're nationally driven, they're also often going to be nationally framed. So maybe it'll tell you something about a state-by-state breakdown, and maybe it won't. So you'll kind of get a sense when you guys look at the full report that we're going to move back and forth between Florida, and I like to think of it as Florida or whatever our specific topic is for any project, and then that topic in context, right? Because Florida doesn't exist in a vacuum. Tennis doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we look at not just tennis, but also sports more broadly. We look not just at Florida, but also the United States. And we look at people and specifically at women, right? And so that kind of back and forth is something that you'll see throughout the report in the landscape scan. And then for Aasha, will talk a little bit more about this, but what we call extant data, pre-existing data that you guys had that we didn't go out and find, that was very, very specifically Florida focused. But given that this was framed as being about women in tennis, one of the first areas that we were going to look at was sort of thinking broadly about equity in sports, equity in tennis, gender, but also intersectionally, all of these other types of equity that come up. And especially for tennis, one of the things, you said, what did we find? You will not be surprised to hear, given how well you know tennis, that one of the things that gets talked about a lot is economic access to tennis, right? Tennis is often, I'll say from the research, but also from my anecdotal experience of the world, right? Tennis is often thought of as something maybe more expensive, right? Having access to tennis, to places to play it, to people to teach it, to structured tennis instruction, right? Is right. So there's a lot of conversation, and this will come up in the report. There's a lot of conversation about how to broaden access, full stop, to tennis which is one thing. So there's broadening access, and then there is broadening support for taking advantage of the access, right? So maybe the courts are there, but there's no one to teach. Maybe the courts are there and there's someone to teach, but the program's too expensive. So then how do you invite more people in, right? So that's one thing that came up a lot. Equity is one of our underlying values. It's one of the things that brought us together as Clarity. So then that affects how we think about things. It also affects what projects we're actually interested in doing, right? So this one was exciting to us. The other thing is, I'll say it quickly, I don't want to talk for too long, but we mentioned those 3 areas that we split things into: playing, coaching, and leadership. So one of the things that research can do is sometimes give you better support for what you think you're going to find, right? Sometimes it will surprise you and you have to be willing to be surprised. And sometimes maybe it's not going to be such a surprise. What it's going to do is confirm what you know, but you can't insist that it confirm that it.
That's a good one.
That's the thing I'm going to keep coming back to. But so when we went to look at women in tennis, and if we take coaching as an example, one of the things in our conversation early on was there aren't enough. There aren't enough women coaches. Why aren't there more? How can there be more? Those sorts of questions. So the research does, in fact, support that, not just anecdotally, but recorded through multiple reputable sources. It does seem like perhaps there are not enough women coaches in tennis. And because research is specific, one of the specific places that comes up is there's an annual report card on women coaches in sports. And this one is specifically NCAA Division I. And it's women's teams and who's coaching those teams, right? So one of the things that comes out is research can tell us that a few years ago, only 41% of women's teams, so women's sports teams at that level, had women coaches. 41% doesn't sound like a terrible number, but that means that, first of all, we're about 51% of the population. We'll just throw that out there, right? So that means that 60% of women's teams have male coaches, and even more men's teams have male coaches, right? So then this begins to give you a picture. Maybe it's not the worst number in the world, but it could be better. Now, research can also tell you that for 9 years straight, that number crept up, but it only got to 46%. Over 9 years, right? So it's a mixed bag. Maybe the numbers aren't great. Maybe there's improvement. And then that can help guide you for your next research question, right? How did that improvement take place? How can it be replicated, et cetera?
Wait, I'm so glad that you used that example first, because when we first started digging into women in the tennis space, and particularly in the coaching piece, this was my first clue in any regard that having a woman coach wasn't normal. And I talk about this with our staff all the time. So this is an example. Like, if you had asked me 10 years ago if there were a lot of women coaches, I would say, yes, every coach I had growing up was a woman. And like, I don't understand what you're talking about here. And I started to talk to my female colleagues who had played tennis and had played other sports. And almost all of them universally said, I never had a woman coach. And I'm like, how did I get this lucky? That like when I was a kid and I played multiple sports, that in high school, all 3 of the sports I played had women coaches. And I thought that was normal. But then it triggered that thought in my head of like, well, of course, that's why I see women in those positions now as normal, because I had that example. And so that we started going down this, hey, girls need to see women as coaches and as leaders, because it does influence them. And so that one example you just gave of like the data maybe not showing what we expected is kind of one of the reasons we went down this path to begin with, because it was so shocking to me that only, I think it's 25% or less of tennis teaching professionals are women. And that is such a low number to me that it's kind of baffled me in a lot of ways. So even though those numbers are creeping up on the NCAA scale, it's interesting to have the context of then how much different tennis is compared to even that 41% number. It's so much lower. And you'd wonder, why is that? Right? Why is it so much lower?
Well, and it's fascinating too, because if you, from around the same time as that first number I gave you, the 41%, the percentage of women coaches, again, in not teaching coaches, right? So at college level,
Yep.
was around 41%, right? So it was sort of on par with the broader sports landscape. But then when you move to tennis in a different setting, right? And this is where you get into who's playing, who's doing what kind of tennis, right? Then the number drops way down.
It's super fascinating to see it in the overall context. And I think, again, that wasn't something that we expected coming into this, but getting into the overall picture and sort of how it compares or maybe how it challenges what we thought is just sort of a fascinating look at it. And it was one of the most eye-opening things, I think, for me. Aasha, I want to come to you for a second, because you really challenged us in a good way in this process to think carefully about what our goals were with the research and overall in this space. In fact, I think we spent 2 weeks as a team rolling around with these questions of like, what are you trying to do here with this research? Like, what would the outcome be of this? And that really resonated with me, because I know we've had information come out on this topic that people have really struggled with. Well, what do we do with it now? Like, we've got information, now what? And so when you asked us that question before we even had anything, I think it really opened our minds in some ways of really thinking through, like, what are we trying to accomplish by even gathering the information? So based on kind of what we've shared with you in that, did you see, or do you see a clear path emerging for us that maybe we as USTA Florida and even our industry can really embrace and do something with? And you're on mute. You're on mute.
I do see a clear path, and that path both emerges from the landscape scan, as well as conversations with USTA Florida, as well as the data that USTA Florida is collecting about its services. So one of the things that came up in the landscape scan as we're reviewing the landscape of women in tennis was a set of recommendations that were authored by Cal State East Bay, St. Mary's College of California, and the Positive Coaching Alliance. Together, they have a set of recommendations that are evidence-based about, hey, how can we get more girls involved in sports? The very first recommendation was have more or promote more either girls-only or girls-centered programming.
Okay.
So that is an example there of like, oh, this is a recommendation that comes from other people's work that is out there in the world. Is it applicable to this particular sort of program, project, process? And it actually strongly corresponded with something that USTA Florida had already started doing, which was providing girls-only tennis camps. And then when you look at those girls-only tennis camps, and one of the questions that you all had asked parents was, hey, did the fact that it was girls-only influence signing up your daughter for this camp? And the answer was a resounding yes. So here we have kind of a confluence of like, oh, this is happening out there in the world in other sports generally. And here's actually what's happening in your particular service area. And so we see those two things coming together, which is it gives us a path, or it gives the tennis industry a path to move forward and think about, hey, what should we do? So Candace and I often like to say part of our work is moving from the descriptive to the interpretive, from, hey, what does this data say, to what does it mean for our work? So it's not enough to just constantly be comparing and thinking, which we all could. the next step is then, okay, cool, now what?
Right.
You know, what does it say? Why is that important? What are we going to do about it? That is our entire sort of circle and approach to this. And that path is the answer of girl-centered programming is one way forward.
What was interesting about that too is I think initially we were really almost myopically focused on girls for the reasons we talked about earlier. It's like girls need to see women in these positions. And then this year we started saying, well, you know what? Maybe that actually is something that adult women want too, is to be around women only. And so we started doing like, well, let's do women only coaching things and see if that works. And then let's do like a women's only speaker training and see if that works. And, you know, you mentioned the surveys that we do, and resoundingly, we hear the same things coming up again and again. It's like, yes, I actually had a better experience because it was all women, or yes, I actually would prefer to go to my next training to be all women. And so it was, even though it started with the girls, we were sort of trying to figure out, hey, is this something we've seen it happen in STEM and we've seen it happen in other sports, to see all women opportunities that aren't just social in nature, which I think we have those where it's like, oh, you know, come to this networking event, like networking and mentorship. But it was like, how about if there were like real learning and hands-on experiences? Like, would that matter? And anecdotally, we're seeing that, yes, that matters too. And so that just giving that example to say, how can we use this research to say, hey, does it match up with actions and what we're seeing anecdotally? And should we do more of this? Has been so incredibly helpful to us to have like a clear path to say, okay, we're either on the right track or we're not.
And I think part of what's great about actually conducting research about a topic is that you can see whether your either personal or particular experiences align with the bigger context. So, Laura, as you said, I always had female coaches. I already had women coaches. Well, turns out that's not the typical experience. So we don't, you know, sometimes we want to rely on, oh, this is how it worked for me. But most of the times not, because we do not know how particular or different our experiences are from everyone else.
And even within
we don't know until we ask, until we check, right?
Yep.
And even within tennis, like that was another thing that I found is kind of like a blind spot in some ways, is that, you know, from a nonprofit space where we're very heavily female. Now, the decision-making space is a different story in some cases. But I think sometimes it created this blind spot where it's like you look around the room at, say, like a USTA event, and you've got tons of women volunteers, you have women staff, and just on a cursory level, not doing the critical thinking side, you say, but we got a lot of women in the room. Seems like we're doing pretty good, right? And without digging into the like, okay, let's get a little more specific in that. What roles are those women playing? And does that reflect other aspects of the industry? And if it doesn't, why is there such a gap in that space where 25% of the coaches are women, but, you know, 50-60% of the room at any of our non-for-profits is women, and in some cases it's even higher. It's, you know, at the grassroots level, it can be, you know, 80-90% of who's running, you know, community tennis associations, and others could be women. And so even within our own little ecosystem, it can vary so greatly.
And that variation gives us some insight on what are the paths potentially forward. Every solution is not going to work in every single context.
Well, as you all finish up the report, which I know we're super eager to get it out there, but you know, we want to give time and energy, and it's been such a wonderful journey. What do you think? You do this for a living, so you guys have done more of these than we have. What do you think the impact would be of us sharing this kind of information? When I say the information, I mean the good, the bad, and anything else that we find, and just, you know, putting it out there with our broader industry, like, this is the state that we're in. These are the findings. These are things that are actionable items that we can engage in. Do you think there'll be a big impact to that? And do you have any recommendations for the audience that's listening to this in terms of maybe how to digest that information, especially if it can be like uncomfortable for them? Because it might be, you know, we might have people listening who've been in the industry a long time and might say, you know what, this is uncomfortable for me to hear, you know, some of this information or some of the action items. So I know that's a really deep question, but I think I asked two of the best people to answer it.
So I'm going to jump in here. You gave us very helpful guidance on who you're going to ask questions to first, and we're just trouncing all over it, so I apologize.
That's okay. I love talking to you. You answer whatever word you want.
I'm going to jump in on this one, partially because I have very strong feelings about it.
Okay.
And those feelings are backed up by a lifetime now of doing research and also teaching, and in both of those ways, and being an editor, right? In all of those cases, we get this discomfort question. And the basic answer is to embrace that discomfort. There's no way around it, right? And I get why sometimes it is uncomfortable for people to hear that things are not as everyone wishes them to be, right? And that might be because people disagree on how they should be, and it might be because we agree on how it should be and it's not that way, right? Those are all viable options. It is uncomfortable. But the state of things is the state of things, right? Reality doesn't change just because we don't like it. A lot of us would snap our fingers or wiggle our nose bewitched style and right, just fix a thing, and we can't. So sometimes what you find is going to make you uncomfortable, and you have to embrace that. Here's the thing. Actually being able to see how things are, and this is one of the main things that research is great for, right? Research is a first step to making intentional change. You can change whatever you want, but intentional change requires that you actually see what you're working with, right? You have to actually see how things are, and sometimes that's not going to be perfect, right? So if research is the first step to being able to be deliberate about it, and sometimes it's going to show you something that's maybe not what you wanted to find out, right? Embrace that. That's how you know something isn't right, but it's also how you start to figure out how to fix it, right? Or how to improve things. So if research can help us clearly describe, come to understand a problem, think about steps forward, then that discomfort at the beginning is honestly a really small price to pay, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't go through that step, you're not going to fix a problem by avoiding it.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've tried in my personal life. It's not how it works,
I think
right?
we've all tried.
We've all done that. That
You
drip
get that
in the faucet.
anxiety. And I think some of it is we didn't want to just put information out there without any like actionable solutions, right? There's nothing more, in my mind, more anxiety inducing than saying we're doing a really terrible job at this, or we're not doing this well, but we have no way to figure out how to do it well. So we're just going to sit in this like pit of despair. And I think that that's sort of the piece that I think we really wanted to bring to the table, with not just information about maybe what was working or what wasn't working or where we were, but sort of what do we need to do more of? What can we try and bring everybody in, right? So that sort of idea of like, we want to bring you into the conversation and into the action, not push you away. And that was something that I think was really important to us. Is it's a call in, not a call out to the industry, to say, we now have information that tells us how we can affect change. In fact, we've tested some things that seem to be working on some level. Let's all get in here together. Let's all get in the boat.
We can all jump in and do. Yeah.
Yes.
And funnily enough, the second recommendation on one of the things that we mentioned earlier, so the first recommendation is do women-focused things. And the second recommendation is intentionally create structured opportunities of and understandings of male allyship.
Yes. That comes up so often in our discussions, and it's come up many times, I think, for the last couple of years. And one of my colleagues, who may or may not ever listen to this, talks about it all the time, and I bless her for it. But that is the truth. It's like, let's all get in the boat, right? It's not an either or. It's a, hey, hey, everyone in the industry, we all know we need coaches. We all know we need more leaders. Like, we need more. We have more tennis now. We need more, 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 more. So let's all bring.
There's a whole pool out there that is not yet tapped out.
That's right. That's right.
I would add, years ago, I had a colleague named Chad, and he used to always say, you cannot oops your way into excellence. And he was the director of diversity, inclusion, and equity at the YMCA. And to that, I'd say, yeah, you cannot oops your way into excellence. It's going to require being uncomfortable, thinking about what's working, looking at what's working. And if it's not, okay, what do we need to change? What do we need to restructure to make it work better? I think Candace and I would add that you can't oops your way into excellence. You can't oops your way into equity. It's going to require deliberation, and it's going to require genuine looking at the state of things. And again, not just wallowing in despair, but here are the state of things. This is what is working. This is what is not working. How do we move forward with what is working?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I have one more question for you. I don't think it's as hard as the last question. It was my first, but I knew you two would ace it. So my last question actually is, what advice or guidance would you give to other organizations? It doesn't have to be tennis. It could be other organizations in sports or just in general, and maybe trying to figure out how to approach this issue of gender equity in their work.
So I don't know if this will be the answer that you expect us to start with or not.
I have no expectations. I'm going to tell you that. We started out with trash pandas and raccoons.
I mean, look, if you start with mini bears,
yes,
all gateways are open after that.
Everything else makes sense.
We should, you know what? We should actually just Aasha decide that, like, any podcast we do, that's where we're going to start, because then who knows what's coming next. I love it. The first advice that we would actually give is, in fact, for people who are trying to figure it out and trying to work on it. And it's just keep going. It is very, very easy to get discouraged because, as you might be able to tell, you can guess this. We all know this anecdotally, and research bears out. Gender equity is a complex issue. It's a complex problem. It's going to have many and varied solutions in different contexts at different times, right? It's complex. That means it's not going to be that straightforward, easy answer that most of us would love to get for something. So the first thing we would actually say is it's an important first step to recognize, oh, gender equity is something we need to work on. How do we do that? Great first step. Keep going, right? Figure out, I mean, this may be sound a little self-serving, but like, if you're not sure where to start, might we recommend some research, right? Have someone help you get a clear picture of what's going on in your arena, which can then help you. And you can do this in your organization. You can do this with the help of others outside of your organization. You can do it with the help of other people and organizations who are doing the work that you do, right? Because it's not just USTA Florida, right? It's also the Women's Sports Foundation. It's also, right, whoever the other people are, right? Figure out what the questions are. Talk to people. What are other people doing? Do some research in a structured fashion. Have someone come and help you formulate some really solid research questions for your specific context. And then you've got a clear picture and you can start to figure out, all right, what's the next step? You're not going to fix it all overnight. So then just what's the next step?
And you probably aren't going to fix it all ever. And I think that's the part that really people get stuck on. It's like, okay, so when are we done? It's like, you're never done. Like, the world is constantly evolving, changing, and the scope of this work, is ongoing. So even, the US Open is a perfect example that, the men and women are using the same ball now, which is like a major aha moment, right? That prior to this, they did not use the same ball at the U.S. Open, and that just came up today. You know, it was like, yeah, no idea, right? No idea.
But what do you mean they didn't use the same ball?
Right. And it's just a different type of tennis ball. And like, it's really funny that, you know, you'll start to uncover more. And so in order, you know, and I say this all the time to my team, like, we do the hard things here. That's what kind of differentiates us. It's not like, oh, okay, we're going to do this with these girls' camps and then we'll be done. And yay, we've tackled equity. And 20 years from now, it'll pay off when these girls are leaders in our industry. You know, it's not finished, and it's always evolving, and you're always learning something. You're like, well, we didn't do that. We never even thought of doing that before. So I love that you said that, where it was just like, keep going, just keep going, because every step is you either learn from it, you move forward, and those kind of things. So I love that you said that, Candace, as just like a bit of advice is it's hard and keep going.
It's hard. Don't feel like you're doing something wrong because it's hard. It is hard. And keep going. And this is, especially if you are talking to other people in tennis, this is a sport. Athletes say all the time, no, I'm always learning. You don't like learn how to play the sport and then stop practicing.
Yeah, so true.
Right? You got to keep working on it.
We would sort of Clarity's approach to equity is that it is integrative. It's integral to all the stuff that you are doing. It is not additive. It is not secondary. It's not an add-on like, oh, here's a little sprinkle on top. Equity. Oh, yeah, here's some girls. Yay. That's not what this is. Yeah. Yeah, that's not what gender equity is. It's going to be part and parcel to the approach to whatever it is. Yeah. It's the whole thing. It's the whole thing. So once the state of affairs is acknowledged and you want to work on it, keep working on it.
That's awesome advice. And, you know, I can't say enough about how much we've learned in the time that we've worked with you both. And I think the fact that this piece is so core to who you are was why we made the choice to work with you on this project, is that we knew this was something that mattered to you and your business. And it wasn't just us going out to some consulting firm that could do whatever we asked them to do, right? But you had such an investment in this piece of equity that we knew that you were feeling it and living it in your own world every day. So of course you were going to ask the questions and dig deeper. And I thought that mattered a lot. And I think I tend not to give advice to anyone because I feel like I still have so much to learn, but I would say to anyone looking for someone to do this work, whether, you know, of course I would recommend you all first to everyone, and I have, so hopefully your phones will ring. But find somebody who genuinely lives and embodies the issue that you are trying to solve, because they will automatically be your partner in that effort in a way that maybe other vendors wouldn't be. And you all have just been phenomenal, and you could tell you spent so much time with us because you truly cared. And that, you know, we'd schedule an hour and we'd have an hour and 45-minute meeting about what we were trying to accomplish in this research, and that we've gotten so much out of it. And I think, you know, there's more work for us to do, and I just genuinely appreciate all that time and energy you've given to us. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us on the show today, and thank you for giving us a chance to look at these questions.
As a true panda would. So
full circle.
Full circle.
Pay attention, folks. Full circle.
Well, thank you both. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I can't wait to share the research with our audience. So much appreciated for all the time you've given us.
Thank you so much.
That's all for this edition of USTA Florida's Here to Serve podcast. For more episodes of the podcast, including upcoming topics, guests, and dates, please visit USTAFlorida.com/here to serve. Thank you for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.